Once again, we're moving back in time, and we're meeting two people whose fate was tethered to far-flung family. One being from an ancient nomadic folk, and the other had the weight of slavery around his shoulders. Welcome to African Roots, brought to you by DW. In this podcast series, we discover how individuals from across Africa shape the continent. I'm Laila Johnson-Salami.
And I'm Cai Nebe.
Cai, I'm going to jump straight into this one because...
Because what?
This man is a controversial figure. He's part of Nigerian folklore. Well, actually, northern Nigerian folklore. In fact, he's even remembered in praise songs.
Right, Laila, but who are we talking about?
It's Usman Dan Fodio, and today he is perhaps best known for leading the greatest jihad in Nigeria and West Africa.
Oh, Laila, in today's context, jihad, now, that sounds kind of ominous.
Well, true, Cai, but we're not talking about today's context. We are talking about the late 18th century. Also, he's known in philosophy circles, but we'll get into that a bit later. So, Usman Dan Fodio was born on the 15th of December, 1754, in the Hausa-speaking region of Gobiwara, in what is today's northern Nigeria. Back then, it was a city-state, and Usman Dan Fodio descended from Fulani people. Side note, by the way, Fulanis are one of West Africa's most widely dispersed and biggest ethnic groups, spread across several countries.
Okay, and why is that?
Traditionally, Fula people were nomadic pastoralists, herding cattle across the vast West African plains and Sahel regions. And when I say widely, their presence stretches from Chad and the Central African Republic to Senegal, so very wide, and their presence predated European mapmakers and empire builders.
Right, so basically a nomadic group that kind of moved across that whole region then.
There we go, exactly. And from what we can gather from Usman's early days, he was known to be a devoted Muslim. His father was an Islamic scholar, and his mother, Hawa, is said to have been a descendant of the Prophet Muhammad.
Wow, that's some pedigree, and that stretches back thousands of years, right?
That's it. And Usman Dan Fodio becomes a student of the Quran and travels around Nigeria. His travels extended north into Agadez in what is Niger today, above Nigeria, where he was influenced by a teacher called Jibril ibn Umar, a well-known mentor at the time, and one whose teachings had a big impact on Usman Dan Fodio.
So, Usman Dan Fodio, he was well on the way to becoming kind of a preacher or a holy man or something, right?
Kinda. From 1774, he became known for traveling through the countryside and preaching Islam. Historians point out that through his travels, not only did he spread Islam, but he also spread the knowledge to read and write, which, as you can probably imagine, wasn't a given in those days.
Right, but did he just do it because it was straightforward? I mean, did anyone oppose him? Did people have other religions? What was the situation like?
Good question, but oppose him not particularly, as Usman Dan Fodio at least, who by this time was given the respectful title of Shehu. He became increasingly known and indeed popular, but local Hausa rulers did consider him a nuisance, and they did try to stop him. See, Usman Dan Fodio preached a much stricter form of Sharia Islamic law, one that appealed to people who had suffered injustice under corrupt rulers. Basically, to local rulers, Usman Dan Fodio's preaching undermined their authority.
Political corruption was becoming widespread in Hausa land. Injustice by the rulers, known as the Sarakuna, was also on the increase. Confiscation of property.
That's Professor Mohammed Tukur Usman, head of the history department at Usmanu Dan Fodio University in Sokoto. And yep, it's a university named after Usman Dan Fodio.
I was just about to ask.
So all this now became also part of the issues that Shehu was addressing not only the issue of education, but also now trying to change the society that will be based on the Sharia, trying to create a society that would be different from the one that the Hausa Sarakuna or the Hausa rulers were leading at that time.
Right. So did they actually manage that?
Well, the peace was about to be broken. Usman had gained significant support among the people that he had preached to. Not just that, Fulani pastoralists also supported him, especially after Hausa rulers imposed a cattle tax on them. In 1804, King Yumfa of Gobir sent his army on an expedition to go after Usman.
And was Usman able to react to that?
Well, yeah, by declaring jihad, or holy war. Now, while Usman Dan Fodio himself didn't do any of the fighting, he was the religious figurehead, and in holy war, the religious leader tends to be quite important, right? And as the war spread throughout the region, Usman Dan Fodio united the Hausa states under Islamic law.
So, Laila, if he didn't really fight, what kind of stuff did he do then?
Well, good question. I mean, he wasn't just sitting there doing nothing. He essentially gave the military expeditions his blessings and handled diplomatic questions, you know. He was also good at portraying the war as an attack on Islam, and therefore jihad was seen as the correct response. Remember as well, Cai, this is a man who had been seen as an Islamic philosopher and scholar for decades, and together with his brother Abdullahi and his son Muhammad Bello, he established a new school of Islamic thought in West Africa.
Okay.
Then, by 1812, the Sokoto Caliphate was established, and this marked a seismic shift in how the region's political structures operated. The Caliphate and its many emirates and sub-emirates replaced the Hausa states. And this success was partly due to Usman's supportive network, according anyway to Dr. Muhammad Bello at Gombe State University.
Because of the fact that Dan Fodio was Fulani by tribe, even before he started the jihad, he had long-standing relationship with the Fulani of Futatoro, Futajalon, and even down to the Cameroon. Because of that widespread and the nature of the Fulani people moving from one part to another in the African continent, that gave him the opportunity, while relating with them, to also expand Islam. Usman Dan Fodio gave contribution of spreading Islam either by himself or by his son Muhammad Bello or by his younger brother Abdullahi Dan Fodio.
But Laila, doesn't it sound like Usman Dan Fodio was just sort of using Islam as a vehicle to fight for power? Like, would it be correct to say he was almost a warlord?
Well, you know, you have to remember that he was operating from a situation where most of his followers were oppressed. Usman Dan Fodio had never pandered to local kings or rulers. As a religious man, for him, he only answered to his God, right? And what he wanted to establish was a non-exploitative system that, in accordance with Islam, was a society run by law, order, and bureaucracy. Importantly, though, Cai, his leadership brought the Hausa states under a single administration for the very first time.
Okay, I guess unity is a good thing, but did it actually work?
Well. The Sokoto Caliphate went on to become the most powerful economic and political system in the region during the 19th century and contributed profoundly to the Islamization of northern Nigeria and also some other states in West Africa. As for Usman Dan Fodio, he became Sheikh Usman Dan Fodio, and after practically establishing the caliphate, returned to teaching in 1811. And he continued to teach until his death, which was about 6 years later in April 1817. And he died in Sokoto. But
what?
While, you know, many in northern Nigeria view him as a great unifier who sought to subdue the authority of local leaders through the leveling power of Islam, Usman Dan Fodio's legacy has in a way been tarnished in recent years.
Why? Has there been more stuff found out about him, or have there been recent revelations?
Well, not about him, and let me rephrase that actually, maybe not his legacy, but with the rise of armed groups like Boko Haram and the Islamic States of West Africa, these groups have claimed their will to revive the old Islamic Caliphate in northern Nigeria. But the thing is, Cai, the ideology of these groups is in stark contrast with the ideals that were put forward by Usman Dan Fodio. For example, while modern education is forbidden by these radicals today, Usman was known to support education for all. And to add to that as well, I must also say several of the victims of these groups today have been other Muslims, which as well is something that Usman Dan Fodio fought against.
It's fascinating that you say that, to say that his legacy has been, really misconstrued. Even at the start of this podcast, when I said, the word jihad automatically has sort of negative connotations because, I guess, of its association with terrorism in Nigeria. And it is probably to do with what we know of groups like Boko Haram and Islamic State in West Africa that, it's very hard to see them as modern anything anymore.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more. Even so, though, Usman's legacy is not without its critics, particularly when you consider the religious divisions in Nigeria today. But I must say, it's so important not to combine his legacy with the level of extremism that we're seeing today.
When we come back, we meet another West African leader whose legacy as a modernizer still carries through today, but it too has a tarnished reputation.
DW African Roots. Find new African Roots episodes on dw.com/African Roots, Spotify, iTunes, and wherever you get your podcasts.
We're back, Laila.
Yes, we are.
Your telling of Usman Dan Fodio is an interesting tale of legacy. And I think legacy is just such a fascinating thing because it, down the years, it can always be misconstrued. And for me, it's also it's an important concept in the person I'm going to be chatting about now.
Interesting. Okay, who are we speaking about?
It's William Tubman, or Tubman as it's actually pronounced, the 19th president of Liberia, or as some call him, the father of modern Liberia. Now, he's an interesting leader for a number of reasons, but we also have to look at his country of origin, Liberia.
Liberia is one country that I've always found quite interesting in West Africa. I've never been. I've always wanted to visit. But hey, it's good. We're staying in West Africa.
Yes, and one of the first things people tend to know about Liberia is that together with Ethiopia, it was one of only two nations in Africa that was never colonized as such by European power. And part of the reason for that is that Liberia was founded in 1847 as a nation for returnee slaves who had suffered under the slave trade. So free slaves now theoretically had a place to go to back in Africa. And as weird as it sounds, a nation in Africa in those days was seen as a solution for the slaves who had been freed in the United States.
So the idea was to basically send former slaves and their descendants literally back to Africa, even if their origins weren't in Liberia.
Exactly. I mean, I know it sounds absolutely crazy in today's context. And believe it or not, at the time, it was actually a very progressive idea because while the slave trade had been abolished, slavery was still very much practiced in the United States. In fact, sending freed slaves was seen as the solution to not antagonize southern states in America and also to assuage fears of white people in the United States because those people did not want to compete with freed slaves for jobs. And it's pretty crazy. Like, this all sounds very strange. And finally, it was also an idea to give black people real freedom. So that's why Liberia is called Liberia, and it comes from the word liberty.
I mean, in today's world, it does sound strange and almost unbelievable, but at the same time, I do get what you're saying about how that could have been seen as progressive back then. That being said, I mean, it's a good thing that as humans, we just evolve and realize that certain things that made sense 100, 200 years ago are now looked at as crazy. And weren't there people already living in the territory of Liberia?
Yeah, a very good point. And exactly that point caused a lot of problems. So-called America-Liberians came to the land of Liberia, and these people took power, and to a large extent, they subjugated the region's native population because they saw the natives of Liberia as being beneath them, in a weird twist of irony here. And William Tubman was born into an America-Liberian family. Relations between the America-Liberians, who lived mainly on the coastal region, and the indigenous Liberians, who lived mainly inland, were pretty bad. And this is the society that William Tubman was born into in 1895.
Interesting. Okay, so let's find out more about William Tubman. What about him?
Yeah, so now that we're all caught up, William Tubman, he was born in southern Liberia under pretty harsh conditions. His stonemason father was a very strict disciplinarian, and he made his children sleep on the floor to toughen their character. Imagine that, Laila.
Wow.
So from humble beginnings, Tubman first qualified as a pastor, and then he became a tax collector in the civil service, and before long he was studying law, and finally, aged 23, he passed the bar.
Interesting. So, I mean, he's done all of this, but then how did he go from studying law and being this person to then becoming a politician?
Well, maybe the more relevant question is, how did he go from being a pastor to becoming a politician?
But there we go. That's it. How did he go from being a pastor to becoming a politician?
Well, Tubman was also a shrewd guy. He realized that the majority of Liberians were ruled by a very small clique of political elites known as the True Whig Party. This is where the power in Liberia lay. So throughout his various jobs as a judge, a prosecutor, and other public offices he held, he garnered support from people outside of this clique. He started advocating for constitutional rights of the tribespeople, the people who were not considered part of the elites, which also just basically meant people who had not descended from America-Liberians. And he began, and this was a blueprint, he began winning local elections, and the True Whig Party realized his potential. But they were a bit worried about him. So in order to kind of cut his wings a bit, they demoted him by giving him a job at the Supreme Court, which the idea was actually to curtail his political ambitions. But Tubman was having none of this, and he announced his candidacy for president anyway, and he won the ensuing election.
Okay. And I mean, is there a twist here or...
Nope. He came to power in 1944. And at the time, people thought, okay, this must be a populist. And, he was known as a bit of a playboy in those days. He was of a very gregarious background. People actually thought he wouldn't last long in power.
Well, I'm always rooting for the underdogs. So I'm liking this story so far.
Yeah, but becoming president of Liberia wasn't exactly a prize. The country was severely underdeveloped, very poor, and definitely unequal. Much of the economy was actually tied to one company, the Firestone Rubber Company. And there was very little in the way of basic infrastructure. There were hardly any roads, for instance. Historian Emmanuel Buer recounts that Tubman's rule brought definite changes.
When Tubman came to power, we did not have the new executive mansion. We did not have the Capitol building. But by the end of his administration, we had all these things, plus the roads going all through the country.
A quote often attributed to Tubman is that Liberia did not receive the benefits of colonization.
Seems controversial.
Very, especially listening it in today's ears.
Yeah.
But what Tubman meant at that point is that in terms of infrastructure, no wealthy powers had invested much. So President Tubman introduced the open door policy, which basically sought to attract huge foreign investment. And he brought this in the speech that we can also hear. We have a clip of that speech here.
In the morning of this new day that has dawned, there is a great urge by the people for higher standards of living, better and greater educational, health and sanitation facilities. Many foreign friends, particularly of the United States and specialized agencies of the United Nations, are rendering assistance and cooperating. But the responsibility is primarily ours.
Okay, and was the policy successful?
Well, certainly most people agree that Tubman's rule was an age of prosperity, kind of golden age, if you will. He had thousands of kilometers of roads built. He sought investors in the rich iron ore deposits to diversify the economy. And by the end of Tubman's rule, foreign investment in Liberia had grown by 200%, and the country had the world's second fastest growing economy. And perhaps surprisingly, some strategic shipping regulations meant that Liberia came to have the world's second biggest mercantile fleet.
Wow. He grew the economy or foreign investment by 200%, the second fastest growing economy in the world. Honestly, Cai, I did not see that coming.
Yeah, and this allowed Liberia to become an exporting nation. The shipping allowed it to become an exporting nation of rubber and iron ore, and foreign funds really flowed into the country. And politically, too, there were changes. So Liberian women could now participate politically, and that's partly due to Tubman. Wadia Koba-Bole, Vice President for Administration at the University of Liberia, explains how.
He was instrumental in getting passed the law for women's suffrage. The article, Chapter 1, Article 11, was changed in 1946, granting voting rights to all citizens of Liberia. So this was the first time that women were now considered citizens of Liberia with voting rights.
I see why he was referred to as a modernizer.
Yeah, true. And this was at a time, in the middle of the 20th century. It's not just that, though. Tubman was always a strong ally of the United States, and Liberia's strategic geopolitical location meant that it was a very good ally for the West to have. However, Tubman was also a Pan-Africanist. Before most African nations had become independent, he participated in Pan-Africanist forums along with Ghana's Kwame Nkrumah, such as the Conference of Independent African States. And these meetings were really precursors to what became known as the Organization of African Unity.
Certainly, this is not a conference to end all conferences, but it is one to which African leaders, imbued with an avid desire for unity, have come to find a way. To His Majesty and the government and people of Ethiopia, we again pay high compliment for this great occasion in the annals of our continent. In the great task to which we have set ourselves at this crucial moment in our continent's history, let us think like men of action, and let us act like men of thought.
Cai, so with all of this to go on, was William Tubman then quite a celebrated figure, I'm guessing?
Well, even though he laid the foundations for Liberia to take off, that did not happen. By the time William Tubman died as president in July 1971, age 75, he had ruled for 27 years in an increasingly authoritarian manner, as you can imagine. If he'd been ruling for 27 years, many of the opposition were kind of subdued. And when it comes to legacy, Liberia's democratic institutions were basically not strong enough. Not even a decade after Tubman's death, Liberia descended into successive civil wars. So stability only returned to Liberia with the election of Ellen Johnson Sirleaf in 2006. And while it's hard to blame Tubman directly for the chaos that ensued in Liberia in the 1980s and 1990s, and of course the reign of Charles Taylor, for instance, as the country was developing economically, there was a severe lack of societal development during his reign. Although there was an influx of money into the country, it wasn't shared around equally, and literacy rates remained staggeringly low for ordinary people. And Tubman, especially towards the end of his reign, was also accused of the same elitism against which he'd campaigned for and the ticket he became president on.
Which makes him a modernizer that kind of leaves a bad taste in your mouth, eh? I guess legacy can also be read differently according to which decade one's in.
Certainly, Laila. And, I'm just wondering about this question, of legacy.
Wondering what, Cai?
Well, because we've talked about two people that, just after their deaths were actually considered, quite amazing modernizers. But as we've heard from both your story of Usman Dan Fodio and William Tubman, there just isn't the same sort of euphoria, is there?
Yeah, to be fair, I do have to agree with you on that. You don't get that euphoric feeling. But You know, this is the thing about legacy, Cai, because it's often never really black and white, and you have these shades and pockets of grey, and you realize that so much can change.
That's where we will have to leave things for today. African Roots is a cooperation between Deutsche Welle and the Gerda Henkel Foundation. Thanks again to Comic Republic for the magical artwork and illustrations. Special thanks to our producer Philip Zandner and our voiceover artists. Contributions by Evelyn Pade and Muhammad Al-Amin. I'm Kai Nebe.
And I'm Laila Johnson Salami.